AMD made a splash in the computing world when they first showed off a prototype Ryzen 5000 chip at Computex in 2021. Showing off a prototype 5900X 12-core CPU with 3D stacking V-cache technology. It was shown increasing performance in gaming by about 15% on average, and that's just gaming. We have no idea what this thing could do productivity-wise. This is kind of a massive shift that's very hard to wrap your head around because AMD is going to be throwing not tens of megabytes of cache on consumer CPUs, but hundreds of megabytes with only 2 chiplets. And so with Intel's Alder Lake CPU architecture coming out sometime soon, and AMD certainly has this technology ready to go for certain products, I like to theorize a little bit about what I would do as AMD for a potential Ryzen V-cache lineup. Also, a bit of a heads up, this is only going to be in US dollars for the US market. So unfortunately, this video might not really be useful to somebody from outside the United States. All right, so first things first, the big question. Is AMD gonna use the 6000 series numbering for these chips? A whole new lineup with a whole new numbering scheme. I honestly kind of doubt it, but I sincerely doubt that we're going to get a full refresh with all of the SKUs getting V-cache. I think like 2 of the SKUs will get V-cache, and then, okay, that's 2 of the SKUs, but like what about the other 2? Like, it would just be clock speed bumps, maybe? So that'd be a little awkward to rename that whole series 6000 when only half of the SKUs have that performance bump. And from my understanding, how this technology works is that it's just expensive to make V-cache in general. You're making a chiplet-sized thing of cache. And so when you have units like the 5600 and the 5800 that when you're moving them primarily by volume and maybe their lower margin, that putting V-cache on them, that if they want to make up for how much that V-cache costs to make by increasing prices, it just doesn't make any sense anymore. I think they're probably still going to be called the Ryzen 5000 series. Maybe it'll be a special edition, or maybe they'll change the letter at the end or something. But speaking of the 6 and 8 cores, I think it's time for a price drop for these models. I'm not a huge fan of the way these things were priced in the first place, and it's been a year since they've come out, and it's been more than 6 months since they've been hard to find. So I think AMD should just straight up make it official that we're gonna get a $50 price drop on the 5600X and the 5800X. And so by getting those prices a little bit more back in line with what Zen 2 launched at, that I feel like it's gonna dissuade people from upgrading to Alder Lake if they can get a 5600X for $250 instead of $300. Now this price drop is just assuming that Alder Lake is mildly competitive, and meaning that it is the same performance for the same price and doesn't have the absurd power consumption of the 11th gen Rocket Lake CPUs. But considering all the leaks and rumors and Cinebench scores and stuff that have come out about Alder Lake, that I am actually genuinely impressed about what the prices and the performance might be. So I think AMD is going to have to go a little bit further with trying to cut the prices. Well, then I think it would be time for AMD to bust out the big guns by introducing new 8 and 6 core SKUs that are even lower priced than those $50 price cuts I mentioned earlier. That they release a 5600 Non-X and a 5700X at the old Zen 2 price points of the 3600 at $200 and the 3700X at around $330, respectively. So if AMD can't increase the performance of their 6 and 8 cores compared to Alder Lake, then the best that they can do is at least get it down basically by $100. But what fun is it in talking about a modern AMD Ryzen lineup without them flexing on Intel a little bit? That I don't doubt that the 12700 and the 12900K aren't going to be impressive CPUs in their own right, but AMD can now charge $800 for their own consumer level CPUs. I don't really see Intel charging past 650, 700. So let's really see what AMD can do. And so that's where the Vcache SKUs come in. Now, for simplicity's sake, instead of calling something the 5950X Vcache edition, I'm just be calling these the 5000V versions of these CPUs. So whatever the model number name is, plus a little V after it. I also chose this letter because AMD hasn't used the letter V yet, at least as far as I'm aware, in any consumer-facing chips anywhere in the Ryzen lineups. So that'd be a little cute. Now, the 5900X is actually a pretty good value in the 5000 series lineup. The $50 price bump didn't hurt that much, but you know, let's lower the 5900X a little bit to $500 to really get in Intel's headspace a little bit and really compete. And let's set the 5900V's price at around like 600 to 650. This price would be very much a win-win for AMD because they give you something that's much more performant for only $100 more. And given how popular the 5900X already is in like pseudo workstation-esque builds that don't use Threadripper, that the 5900V would be an interesting experiment to see how much AMD can get away with charging for something like this for that market. And then the 5950V. Man, if you thought the 5950X was already expensive enough as is, whoo boy, you ain't seen nothing yet. I wish AMD would just charge $800 for this one, considering that it's probably a pretty good profit margin they make on the 5950X already. But I'm expecting AMD to charge $1,000 for it. And if I were in this scenario, I would charge $1,000 for it. Now, my logic is that a 5950X with Vcache in multi-threaded applications would actually get kind of scarily close to the current 3960X Threadripper that's available right now, but for way less. And so I feel like for that much, plus you get better single-threaded performance, but you do lose a lot of the Threadripper features. I think $1,000 is actually a pretty fair price point for nearly that amount of performance, but on a consumer platform. But what about the 5950X, you might ask? That, well, the 5900V might be a pretty good boost, but not everything benefits from cache. Some things just straight up need more cores. Well, what about just having more cores? Now, I would love for the 5950X to stay around with a $50 price drop and just be like this nice part of the lineup that, well, if you just need cores and you don't need Vcache, you can just get this, the most amount of cores you possibly can. But unfortunately, I don't think that really makes that much business sense. The 5950X already was kind of a niche product to begin with. It's a high core count thing on a desktop consumer socket. Like, I love that it exists, but we have a SKU that functions with that same role, but you're charging $200 to $250 more for it, and then you have a SKU that's $150 to $200 less that gets somewhat close, that there's just this weird no man's land that makes no sense. And so I would personally try to save as many of those 5950X golden sample 8-core chiplets for the 5950V and try to sell it for more, rather than try to figure out how to price drop it enough that it's worth it, but not eat the lunch of the 5900V. So yeah, that's my idea for what I would do for AMD's product stack. That at the top Halo product, I would have a 5950V for $1,000, a 5950X that technically still exists on paper, but is basically no longer produced at $750. You have a 5900V at $600 to $650 to be the gaming king. You have your 5900X at $500. And then from there, you have your price drops, your massive price drops. So your 5700 for $330 to $350, your 5800 for $400. You have your 5600X for $250, and then your 5600 for around $200. You are getting more performance per dollar with price cuts and Vcache, but it's staggered out in a way that the price increases don't really affect the vast majority of people who end up buying Ryzen. And so that's how I would design it. That I would limit whatever price increases that would come from Vcache to people who would be willing to shell out the money already instead of people who just want a 6-core or just want an 8-core. So anyways, guys, that's it for the video, and have a good day.